What's up, guys? When I look at the grades, a lot of people did wonderful on the first two parts of this quiz. Sometimes on the first try, sometimes on the second try, but either way, they're good. And then on the third one, we had some lower scores, and we also had some people ask me about it. I got an email, I got a comment to say, hey, can you help with this? Maybe it's not quite as simple. The questions often have concepts instead of just facts, or maybe it's a little bit harder to follow the order because it's not quite chronological the way the beginning was. So I'm going to go through, narrate over a little bit, try to hint without just giving the answers, and hopefully help some of you who have had trouble. First question says, DC tried to imitate Marvel. So Marvel Comics was not that big. They changed their name. They went in and out of different styles. And for a while, they were just making like stories about weird monsters. You may have remembered Stan Lee saying, oh, we just make up a word like Gru and then draw a goofy guy and then see what happened. But Marvel became successful when they were getting popular with teens and 20 somethings instead of the traditional kid audience because they were mentioning social movements, politics, psychology, war, stuff that was at the time very relevant and important and different that other comics weren't. Okay, for example, the Hulk was fighting against the army, which nobody had ever done before. You had to show the army is good. Or Spider-Man was having problems with money and sort of stuff that was not really what you would see in Superman, you know. So DC tried to get into this, and they did a really bad job at first. They had Wonder Woman um, lose her powers, get away from the Greek mythology, wear normal clothes, and try to fight guys with kung fu, and nobody liked it. But the same writer, Denny O'Neil, did a better job with the next one, where he took two old characters that nobody really cared about, and he made it so that one of them was the kind of normal liberal guy who said, yeah, I support these issues, I guess, but I don't want to get too radical. And then the other guy was really radical, and he said, no, we got to fight. We got to help the downtrodden, fight against the power, do what's right. Don't stay in your comfort zone, you know? And it was a big success. People loved the way they approached anti-war protest, civil rights, all of these movements that at the time were described as liberation movements, okay? That was a big deal, okay? So I don't want to say what it was, but it was two characters that were not a big deal. They were kind of brought out of obscurity and made into play this back and forth of the moderate liberal guy and then the really interesting radical guy. And just like this, just like a lot of other really big deals, it wasn't on for decades, okay? It wasn't like a series that was going forever. It wasn't like a movie franchise that lasted forever. It was, the 60s Batman show was for like 2 years. Watchmen, I think 14 issues. Okay, Dark Knight Returns, same thing. A lot of the really important comics or comic-related things that made a difference were one and done and gone, and then they existed as a memory and as an influence, but they weren't just franchises forever. In the 80s, we had politics, but it was a different kind, okay? It wasn't like supporting these young people and movements, and for example, the X-Men were all about, metaphors for civil rights and gay rights and things like that. But in the 80s, it was more, first of all, it was visually dark. You see they have all shadows and things. In the movies, too, Tim Burton's Batman was basically black and white. He was doing the same style as movies from the 30s. They focused on the villains, and the villains were not wacky aliens from Mars. They were not sort of comical sci-fi villains. They were just like at the very beginning of the video when they were talking about the 30s. In the early 30s comics, Superman was fighting against landlords and generals and the guy who would decide, whether you're getting kicked out of your house or whether your country's going to starve. Okay, things like that. in the 80s, the same thing. The biggest villain of all was a businessman sitting in a skyscraper smoking a cigar, and that's what they turned Lex Luthor into, for example. Okay. Speaking of Lex Luthor, Superman was created by guys Siegel and Schuster. We saw them early on, but pretty soon it got taken away from them, and they were not always getting credit. They were not always getting any money. They were not always getting what they thought they were due. And you know what? That still happens today. Pretty recently, a year or two ago, the Guardians of the Galaxy original creators were having trouble getting any credit, any money. They definitely weren't invited to the premieres or things like that. Speaking of the business side of things, the 80s and 90s, the business shifted from, instead of being in a grocery store where, like the comics would be low and they'd be grabbed by kids, the same way kids would grab Fruity Pebbles, the comics are now in a different building, specifically for nerds who might have, the building might also have D&D, or in the 90s they'd have Magic the Gathering. And so now you're making comics for super fans, okay? And when you were doing it in the grocery store, you don't know that they're getting every issue, so you got to keep the story pretty light on continuity, maybe have lots of recaps, because they're not going to, there's not like, okay, you pick up Spider-Man, you don't know what Spider-Man's been doing for the last 10 issues. You have to be able to jump in, you know? But when it's a super fan, they're willing to follow all the details and they're willing to pay more, and it's a different style, and things changed in order to match the situation they were in. That business was changed when they realized, okay, if people are more interested, they're paying more, we're going to give them fancy stuff, we're going to give them limited edition, hologram cover, buy the alternate version, etc., etc. And that can happen pretty well for a while, but then it will crash. It's just like another bubble in the 90s. I don't know if you guys have heard of Beanie Babies, or these toys that were, somehow they took off in value, and then people realized, wait a minute, we all have them and nobody really wants to buy a massively overpriced thing, so the value went down to what it probably should have been all along, and people who expected to have money didn't. One of these companies went bankrupt from this. This is a company who, they were huge for a while, but then they realized we got to sell our stuff to survive. We had to sell our movie rights. So they started with Blade, did okay. They sold that to New Line Cinema. Then they sold X-Men to Fox, did even better. Then they sold Spider-Man to Sony, did even better. And 20 years later, they eventually built up their own giant thing that is one of the big studios, but it took a long time. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about the literary focus on comics. For a while, they were for kids, and then they were for teens, and it was a counterculture side thing, not really rewarded by the mainstream. But the first comic to win a legit literary award that was originally meant for short stories was, well, it's from a guy who wrote one of our short stories. If you look at our assignments for the quarter, one of them was written by a certain guy who also did one of these. That's a pretty good hint, right? 9 is that artists work with Congress, especially DC. I think it's mostly DC that they mention, to do little PSAs, public service announcements, not only in the US, but they handed out ones in Bosnia and South America and so on. And honestly, this one, it's all the above. Okay, if you clicked one of the other ones, you're right, but it's supposed to be all the above, so make sure you get that on a retake. And I haven't said, but you can retake, make up these anytime. Just let me know. Infinite tries at it, okay? Denny O'Neil, the guy in the very first question who did Wonder Woman and it was no good, did the other thing and it was good, eventually worked on Batman, and he did a story where Robin died In fact, it was even kind of worse because they made the readers vote, and the readers voted to kill him. So it's just kind of gross all around. If you looked at that, you would think, I don't know if that's the way to do it. And then he was walking down the street or walking into a store, and people told him, "Hey, you're the guy who killed Robin. What's going on? This is an insult to people, you know." And so he said that he realized that they thought of themselves, he and his coworkers, as, oh, we're fiction guys. We're making a magazine that comes out every month, and we're trying to make a cool story and get some attention. But then he realized that, people care about this as a sort of cultural tradition that must be preserved in a conservative way. So he used a phrase near the end of the documentary that says that they are trying to preserve a certain myth that cannot just be treated the way you might treat whatever cool thing you want to do that issue. Okay, so hopefully this video will help if you are one of the people who asked, or one of the people who's going to retake. Maybe these little hints about each one can give you a better shot. Thanks.